Vamos ahora sí a dar oficialmente la bienvenida a esta tarde, agradeciendo, ¿verdad?, la oportunidad de poder estar acá y
Puedes activarlo
encontrarnos
de
en este
español.
mes de marzo.
Sí,
Recordarles vehementemente, como ustedes ya saben, que en las sesiones de Zoom se nos invita a cerrar nuestros micrófonos para que el ruido ambiente no nos asuste. Muchas veces estamos presentando y nos asusta una voz que aparece por allí, más que todo eso. Así que seamos conscientes de eso. Luego ya cuando lleguen las preguntas y comentarios podemos dar rienda suelta a nuestros micrófonos. No me van a escuchar a mí, van a escuchar ahorita a Ron en un momento. Quisiera, para iniciar, como les decía, a nombre del Centro de Estudios y Relaciones Judio-Cristianas de la Congregación de Nuestra Señora de Sion, darles la bienvenida esta tarde-noche a la segunda charla de una serie de espacios de formación que nos gusta tener a inicios del año dedicado a la relación entre el judaísmo y el cristianismo y los aportes del estudio de la tradición judía para la comprensión de las escrituras. Esta noche estamos muy felices de darle la bienvenida y de contar con el aporte de una hermana de Sion que voy a presentar en este momento, la hermana Celia Deutsch, que en su momento ya va a intervenir. Unas palabras sobre ella serán necesarias para quien no le conoce. La hermana Celia está ahorita establecida en Nueva York, donde ha vivido por bastante tiempo ya. La hermana Celia es investigadora del Barnard College en la Universidad de Columbia, en el campo de la historia religiosa, intelectual y social del judaísmo temprano y de los orígenes del cristianismo, campo en el que ella ha escrito de manera abundante. También la hermana Celia ha desarrollado trabajo de diálogo interreligioso en la ciudad de Nueva York, trabajando con la Comisión Diocesana para el Ecumenismo y las Relaciones Interreligiosas. Entre sus trabajos, ¿verdad? Como docente e investigadora, ella se ha dedicado también a escribir. En los años 90 publicó un libro llamado La Señora Sabiduría, Jesús y los Sabios, metáfora y contexto social en el evangelio de Mateo. Y actualmente está trabajando en un comentario en perspectiva feminista también en el evangelio de Mateo. Eso entre otras obras. El día de hoy, esta tarde, la hermana Celia va a presentarnos el tema Las Madres de Jesús en el evangelio de Mateo. Y pues bueno, agradecer una vez más a la hermana Celia por acompañarnos hoy y hermana, estamos en sus manos.
thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your invitation. I'm really honored, and I apologize that I don't speak Spanish well enough to give this presentation in Spanish. So I ask your patience. Many, many thanks to Ron for his translation and to David for everything. I'm just really happy to be with you. And today we're going to talk about the mothers of Jesus, women in Matthew's genealogy. Um, since most of us, I think, are Catholic, some in your group may be Christians from other traditions, but otherwise we are Catholic. And we're very used to hearing the genealogies of Jesus, especially at Christmas time. The genealogy of Matthew is read right about a week before Jesus's the nativity, and then at the Mass for the Vigil of Christmas. So we've heard it, and I don't know about you, but until about 2 years ago, I would hear that and I would be bored because it's like a list, right? A list of names, and then a list is a list. But it's really important. And as I began to study it more, and when I was working on the commentary, began working on this commentary, I began to get really excited about it. Because something we often don't hear. We're used to hearing Mary's name come at the end of the genealogy, but there are four other women in that genealogy. So there are five women in the genealogy of Jesus. And that's an extraordinary thing because the women aren't usually included in the genealogies. And so I decided to look into these women and see the stories behind them because the genealogy isn't just a list. It's each of those names has a story behind it. And I wanted to learn more about the stories behind these women's names. And I'm still finding out more about them. And I just want to share some of this. Matthew certainly had the stories from the Bible in his mind when he was writing this genealogy. But he also had the stories not just in the biblical text, but in his Jewish tradition, because these stories were already being interpreted by Jews for their own time. So we're going to see a little bit of that as well. The genealogies are important because they tell us who an ancestor is. I mean, I don't know about in Central America, but here in North America, there's a real craze to find out who your ancestors are. And so there are even websites like ancestry.com and 123. And so you can, send in some saliva and you can, they'll run these things through databases and you can get a whole list of your ancestors if you don't know them. And so, and that can be fun and interesting. But why this interest in ancestors? It's a need in many, many cultures. We need to know who our roots are. Who are these people who are our roots, who are our foundation? And so these names are people in Jesus' ancestry that Matthew thought were really, really important. And they were really important because Matthew starts his gospel with the first verse, an account of the genealogy of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So for Matthew, that's who Jesus is. And the genealogy tells us how this happened, how this came all the way to Jesus, how this identity gets passed on to Jesus. And some of the people in that genealogy are women. So it tells us something about Jesus's identity and his mission, and it tells us how this is so. It's a long list of men, but Matthew includes some women who he thinks are particularly important. So I keep emphasizing Matthew and what Matthew understands because he has a different understanding than Luke, for example. Luke is another tradition, another set of traditions. Matthew has his own. And we need to understand we're not dealing with modern day 21st century genealogy created out of a DNA search or a modern historical investigation. Matthew records names that he knows from biblical sources and other sources, and he organizes it according to his purposes that we'll see as we move through these stories and talk about the context in Matthew's gospel. Well, the first of these people is Tamar, and David is going to put up the story of Tamar so we can all read together this story. David.
I'm sorry. Yes, I had that
Don't worry, don't
disconnecting here.
worry.
Problems. So what
It's,
is the text that you need?
we need Genesis 38,
Good.
the story of Tamar.
There we are.
Okay, great. Perfect. Okay, so everybody can see that we're going to move through this and talk about the really important points. The story of Tamar is in one chapter in the book of Genesis. She, it starts with, it happened at that time that Judah went down from his brothers and settled near a certain Adulamite whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua. He married her and went into her. She conceived us and bore a son, and he named He and the daughter of Shua, Bat Shua in Hebrew, have three sons. The first is the second is Onan, and the third is Shelah. So um, they grow up, and so Judah decides it's time for to get married. It's time to marry these boys off. So he gets a wife for his son and her name is Tamar. Tamar means like a date palm tree. It's something very beautiful and it's fruitful and it's graceful looking. So Tamar, we don't know that she's got any say in this. We don't know who she is. We don't know whether she's another of this clan. There's not yet a people Israel. These are still just individual clans, okay? And so is she from the clan of Judah? Is she part of the extended family? Is she a Canaanite? Who is she? We're not told. Her ethnicity is a question mark. And this is going to be important because Matthew it's important because of Matthew and his context. Matthew is probably Jewish, most certainly Jewish in his ethnicity, and he is writing for a community living either someplace in Galilee or maybe in Antioch, which over the border in Syria. The community is predominantly ethnically Jewish, but there are some Gentiles. And that's not unusual. The population in that part of the world and what's now the land of Israel was quite mixed. And the population in Syria also was mainly Gentile, but there was a very large Jewish population there. So there was a lot of mixture. So Tamar herself is a part of the mixture, and she helps Matthew think with his people about what all that means. So there's she gets married to and it says he was wicked in the sight of the Lord, and the Lord put him to death. It doesn't say what he did. Later in Jewish interpreters say he probably never consummated his marriage with her because she didn't have a child. And they also say, they fill in the gaps, you see, and they say, well, what is this happening? And then some of these early interpreters, about a century before Jesus's time, say, well, his mother was a Canaanite woman, so he probably wanted to marry a Canaanite woman. And Tamar was not a Canaanite. And then they said, well, what was she? Well, she was from Mesopotamia, from Padan Aram, like Abraham and like the matriarchs, because Isaac's goes they send back somebody to Padan Aram to look for a wife, and Eliezer Damascus finds Rebecca. She comes back and she gets married. And then Rebecca too, she sends Jacob back to Padan Aram to get a wife. So Jacob comes back with two wives, with Leah and Rachel. So they say to themselves, these early interpreters, she must have been like them. So he didn't want to marry her. And so that little piece gets answered. And then and Matthew may have known that tradition, that she came from the land of Abraham and the other patriarchs. So then Judah says to Onan, go to your brother's wife and perform the duty of a brother-in-law to her.
Inglés. Yo no sabía que era en inglés.
It- and raise up offspring for your brother. What's going on? What is going on is something called the practice of levirate marriage. And this is a practice in which if a woman and a man have no children and the man dies, that means he has no heir, nobody to carry on his name, and nobody to preserve his material goods in the family. Then his nearest kinsman, whether it's his next brother, whether it's a cousin, but his next kinsman is to marry his widow. And their firstborn son will be the heir. So Onan, the next brother, is supposed to do this. Onan marries her, but he clearly does not do his duty. It says that Onan knew the offspring would not be his. He's jealous. So he doesn't want to have a kid who's not going to be considered his own. And so what he does was every time he went to have sexual relations with Tamar, he spilled his semen on the ground, it says in the Bible. And that was displeasing in the sight of God, and he was put to death. So then Judah says to Tamar, remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up, because he feared that he too would die like his brothers. Now, we know, I've heard this personally when I was teaching in Zimbabwe. A student said, among the Shona people, which was his people, he said, the people who are traditional still practice this. And he said, there's a fear that if a man dies mysteriously or unexpectedly, that perhaps his widow has killed him. And so, we see this in the Bible. They're very separate cultures, different parts of the world, many centuries apart. But some of these patterns are quite common. And so he says, I'm going to keep my son Shelah safe and then just kind of buy time. So there's Tamar in her father's house where she doesn't belong, and she's waiting. And Shelah has grown up. And so Judah's wife, Bathsheba, the Canaanite wife, dies. And he waits and he's mourning in his house. But when it's over, he decides he's going to go to the sheep shearing, which is a festive occasion. He and his old friend Hira, the Adulamite, that they were like next door neighbors. They were going to go. And so Tamar finds out that her father's going up to the sheep shearing. So she takes off her widow's clothing and she puts on, wraps herself up in a veil. She veils herself so that she cannot be distinguished. Nobody can know who she is. And she sits down at the entrance to Enaim, which is on the road to Timnah, which Timnah was a place where the sheep shearing was taken. Now, this is a really interesting little piece. Enaim is the same word as the word for eyes. And not eyes is enai. And so it's an interesting play on words because Judah sees the prostitute. He doesn't see Tamar. He doesn't see Tamar throughout all that's going to transpire until the climax, until the end. And so he sees her, thinks she's a prostitute, and he comes over and says, let me have sex with you. And so they negotiate a price. And he says, I'll send you a kid from the flock. And she said, but you have to give me a pledge. I'm not going to just take your word. I need a pledge from you. And so he said, well, what do you want? That Judah's kind of ignorant in this, isn't he? He's kind of silly. He's asking, it's supposed to be his deal, but he's asking her what she wants. And she says, your signet ring, your cord, and the staff that is in your hand. Those are three signs of authority and distinction. And she's asking him to give all that over. So he gives them to her. And he sleeps with her, and they conceive a son. They conceive a baby who will be a son. It'll be twins, actually. And she gets up and leaves and goes back to her father's house. Nobody knows what's gone on. Judah sends the kid by his friend, the Adulamite. And he tells Hira to recover get the pledge back from her because he can't find her. And he asked, where's the prostitute who was at a 9 by the wayside? And everybody says, never saw her. So he figures that the best thing to do is to let her keep these things and go about his business. And about 3 months later, somebody comes, and it's an unnamed somebody. Somebody comes to Judah and says, your daughter-in-law Tamar has prostituted herself and she's pregnant. So Judah says, bring her out and let her be burned. This is dreadful. This is dreadful. By the way, prostitution in ancient Israel was not punished by death at all. But adultery was, although it was stoning. She was brought out, and it says she sent word to her father-in-law. It was the owner of these who made me pregnant. And she says, take note, please, whose these are, the signet, the cord, and the staff. And all this is going on in front of the whole clan, whole village. Everybody sees this. And Judah sees these pledges, and he says, she is more righteous than I, since I did not give her to my son Shelah. In other words, he is acknowledging that he is the one who's in the wrong. She has simply been trying to get what was her due by custom and law. And so she's acquitted, and he did not lie with her again. So then, when it came time for her to deliver her baby, it was 2 babies, twins, Perez and Zerah. And that's the story of Tamar. So Tamar will play a role. Like I said, people will be very curious about her as time goes on. And they recognize, she is recognized for being righteous, more righteous than Judah. Now, the word righteous is really interesting because Matthew really likes this word. And he calls Joseph a righteous man. So Tamar is, in a way, made of the same, she's becomes a, how do I say, not just an ancestor of David and his line through her son Perez, but she's like an implied model for Joseph and for Jesus and Jesus's followers. At least this is the way I think Matthew is thinking of her. So but we move along. We move along. And we get our next woman in the genealogy, our next heroine. By the way, I taught a class in Zimbabwe called Unlikely Heroes, and Tamar was one of them. But another unlikely hero is Rahab in the book of Joshua in chapter 2. And this is another really, it's a great story. Now, there's no questioning about Rahab's ethnicity. She's a Canaanite. And she's a Canaanite, not just at any point, but this is a story set as Joshua is bringing the people of Israel together into the promised land. And they're coming through this area that's of Jericho. And so she has a tavern or an inn, or it's an inn, which is a tavern, and it's set in the walls of Jericho. It's really interesting. She's a Canaanite woman, and she's a prostitute. And she's also an innkeeper. She is other. She's the enemy. She is one of those who's going to be conquered by Joshua and his armies as they take possession of the land promised to the patriarchs. Joshua has sent two unnamed men to spy on her, or not on her, excuse me, on Jericho and the surrounding area. So he says, go view the land, especially Jericho. So they went and entered the house of a prostitute whose name was Rahab and spent the night there. First thing they do is they go to Rahab's house. Now, that sounds really bizarre, except it's right there in the walls of the city as they come in. So it's not as bizarre as it sounds. But there is a comic fact here that her house is actually a perfect place to begin their spying mission. It's an inn, which can be a prostitute's house or brothel, but it was also a place of coming and going. Ancient Babylonian texts suggest that prostitutes who had houses in the city walls might serve as vehicles of information for the king about those entering and leaving the city. So he, excuse me, so if they will, and that is exactly what will happen with Tamar. So at some point, some people hear that these spies are there, and they tell the king of Jericho. And the king of Jericho calls her in and says, some Israelites have come here tonight to search out, and says to her, bring out the men who have come to you, who entered your house, for they have come to search out the whole land. And she plays ignorant. She just plays it cool. And she takes the two men and she hides them. And then she says, true, the men came to me, but I did not know where they came from. And when it was time to close the gate at dark, the men went out. When the men went where they went, I do not know. Pursue them quickly, for you can overtake them. Ha ha. She knew. She had brought them up to the roof of her house. The old-fashioned houses, and you still see this somewhat, but in ancient times, the houses in that part of the world had flat rooftops. Lots of cultures do this. They had flat rooftops. The rooftops could be used for an extra room, for storage, for, kind of hanging out in the evening and getting cool. So she's got flax up there drying, and she puts them under the flax and hides them. So they hide there, and then all at the same time, the king's men are chasing the trail, what they think is a trail, and into the mountains and on the way to Jordan, as far as the river. And then once they've gone, the gates were really shut. So before these guys, before the Israelite spies go to sleep, she comes up and makes a deal with them. And she says, I know that the Lord has given you the land, and the dread of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before you. They've been doing very well militarily as they march, continue their march out of Egypt and towards the land that's promised them. She says, and then she says, we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you went when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the two kings of the Amorites were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, whom you utterly destroyed. And then she says, now since I have dealt kindly with you, swear to me by the Lord that you in turn will deal kindly with my family. She's not just making her own living, she's taking care of her whole family. Give me a sign of good faith that you will spare my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, the whole extended family, and deliver our lives from death. The men say to her, our life for yours. If you do not tell this business of ours, then we will deal kindly and faithfully with you when the Lord gives us the land. So she lets them down. Remember this is in the wall. The wall is facing outwards beyond the city, and she lets them down through the window, through a cord, and and says, go towards the hill country, so that the pursuers may not come upon you. And then she's very specific. She says, hide yourselves for 3 days until the pursuers have returned, and then afterwards you may go your way. And then they tell her to give them a sign, and the sign she is to give them, they say, if we invade the land, do not tie this crimson cord in the window through which you let us down, and you do not gather into your house your father and mother, your brothers, and all your family. If you do not go out of doors, if any of you do go out of doors, they shall be responsible for their own death. So the cord that she's letting them down, which is a crimson, it's red, is a bright red cord. She is to put in the window to be a sign of who she is and where she is, so that the Israelite soldiers coming in will recognize that sign and not touch her or anybody in that house. That will keep her safe. And then she says, according to your word, so be it. And she ties the crimson cord at the window. So they leave and stay 3 days in the hill country, and the pursuers come back. And then the two people go over to Joshua and the son of Nun, and they tell him everything that's happened. And they say to Joshua, truly the Lord has given all the land into our hands. Moreover, all the inhabitants of the land melt in fear before us. And then the story goes on, and Rahab more or less disappears. But Joshua leads his people in. He leads them around Jericho. But the two men who had spied out the land, and this is in chapter 6, Joshua says to them, go into the prostitute's house and bring the woman out of it and all who belong to her, as you swore to her. So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab out along with her brother, her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged. They brought out all her kindred and set them outside the camp of Israel, and then they burned the city. And this finishes by saying, but Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, Joshua spared, Her family has lived in Israel ever since, for she hid the messengers whom Joshua sent to spy out Jericho. So she saves her. Joshua burns her city. Joshua and his men burn the city, but she has saved her family. And she is, and and the story goes on until this day. Her family and all continued to live there ever since. This is an amazing story. Again, it's a story of somebody who's other. She's a Canaanite. And she's not exactly a respectable person, is she? She's a prostitute. And she's a savior of her people. And she recognizes the God of Israel. This story is remarkable because it is one of several stories in which a non-Israelite recognizes the God of Israel. We're going to see this in the story of Naaman. Remember Naaman the Syrian? We just heard that story in the liturgy the other day. He recognizes Israel's God. And then in the book of Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, first himself and then Darius, or Dayarvish in Hebrew, recognize Israel's God. So Rahab is the first of these people. She makes a covenant with the people of Israel and their God. And so she is recognized in the Jewish tradition around Matthew's time as being a prophet. And you could say, well, why is she a prophet? I mean, she's a great woman, clearly. She's a very brave woman. She's a very smart woman. But why is she a prophet? Well, remember when she tells the Israelite spies to go hide themselves in the hill country for 3 days? How does she know 3 days? Well, the interpreters in the times just before Matthew and Jesus said, it must have been the Holy Spirit who inspired her that it would be 3 days necessary before these spies could come out. And so they call her a prophetess, and they call her a mother of prophets. And this is really interesting because Tamar likewise is called a mother of prophets and mother of prophets and kings. And so Rahab is also called a mother of prophets. And then, here we go. Ruth. There we go. Yes. So Danielle's got Ruth for us here. Story of Ruth. This is much longer, and we won't get a chance to go through this is as much detail, but we can find plenty. This is a really, really beautiful book. And I imagine lots of you have read the whole book because it's a very brief book and it's beautiful. But if you haven't read it so far, maybe after tonight you'll read it for yourselves. It's the book of Ruth. And it's a story that looks forward to the birth of David, who's going to be her grandson, David the king, and the ancestor of Jesus, of course. So I'm going to focus on a few points here. First of all, the geography of this. This is, as the story opens, there's a Judean family from the land of Judah, from the house of bread, from Bethlehem, Beit Lechem. That means literally house of bread in Hebrew. They are experiencing a famine in their land. And to escape the famine, the father of the family, whose name is Elimelech, my God is king. That's what that means. Elimelech. He and his wife Naomi, which means my pleasantness or my consolation. They and their two sons, Mahlon and Chilion, they leave Judah to escape the famine and they go to live in Moab. Now, Moab, that's enemy territory. This, once again, it's going into the land of the other. Moab is furthermore a place which was noted during the book of Deuteronomy, in the first 5 books of the Bible. It's noted because the people there refused the Israelites bread and water when they were passing through Moab to the promised land. Furthermore, their women seduced Israelite men and lured them into worshiping their gods. So that country, which turned away the people in their march out of Egypt into what's now the land of Israel and Palestine, that country, that people becomes a place of refuge for Judahites. And they are going to provide food and water for this Israelite family from Bethlehem, the house of bread in the land of Judah. It's a lot of irony and a lot of symbolism, isn't it? So the book of Ruth itself mentions Moab specifically 7 times. They want us to get in on our head that this is a really important feature of this book. Ruth's name, Reut, is the root of it, means friend. And she is called a Moabite several times. The country of refuge is other. And the heroine of the story is other. She's a foreigner. And I think Matthew wants us to just really take that in. Naomi, the childless woman, the childless widow, whose name means my pleasantness, she decides to return to her homeland. Her husband and her 2 sons died. Just think about this. The mother, the father, and the 2 sons leave their homeland. They're uprooted. They're immigrants. They're climate refugees, really, and go to Moab, this land of strangers, and that's enemy territory. The boys marry, the sons marry. They seem to have settled down and made a life for themselves. But then the husband and the 2 sons die. I mean, this is so much loss and so much tragedy and so much trauma. And so Naomi decides, I can't do this. And the girls, she said, Ruth, Naomi, you need to make a life for yourselves. I'm going back to my people. And they said, we're coming with you. We're coming with you. And that's very touching. It's enormous loyalty. But Naomi is insistent. And finally, Orpah, one whose name means the back of the neck, she accedes to her mother-in-law's wish to return to her people. And then, but Ruth clings to Naomi. She says no. And and Naomi makes a last attempt to have her turn back. And she says, in very profound and beautiful words, where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And Ruth seals this with an oath. And she says, may God do thus and so to me and more, even if even death parts me from you. So she casts her lot with Naomi and her people, the Judahites, and their God, much as Rahab had made a covenant with the Israelites, acknowledging their God as the only God in heaven above and on the earth below. So later tradition will understand with these words that Ruth also becomes a convert, and she gets called a convert, and so does Rahab. So Naomi has acknowledged Orpah's and Ruth's kindness to her as chesed, a word that means kindness. And it occurs 3 times in this book. In chapter 2, verse 20, it's in Naomi's words to Ruth. It refers to God's kindness. And in the third, in chapter 3, verse 10, Boaz speaks to Ruth, and he recognizes her kindness or her loyalty. So Boaz is our next character in this story. Boaz is a landowner in Bethlehem, and he happens to be a kinsman of Naomi. And they've just returned to Bethlehem at the time of the barley harvest. So Ruth says to Naomi, let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain behind somebody in whose sight I might find favor. So she says, go, my daughter. So she says, I'll take a back position and have, so maybe somebody's going to leave some gleaning for me. And so that's exactly what she does. She goes to pick up the scraps of the harvesters in the hopes that she can take some home so that her mother-in-law and she can have something to eat and maybe even something to sell. But this field belongs to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. And Elimelech, remember, was Naomi's husband. And so he comes down from Bethlehem and he's, overseeing the harvest and he's talking to the reapers. And so he says, to whom does this young woman belong? And so he says, she's the Moabite woman who came back with Naomi from the country of Moab. She said, please let me glean and gather. And so she came and she's been on her feet from early this morning until now without resting, even for a moment. And so Boaz speaks very kindly to Ruth. Now, the text calls Boaz the Goel, and the Goel means a redeeming kinsman. He's the kinsman who is supposed to step in and make sure that a person's property stays in the family. So it's his job to make sure Elimelech's property stays in the family. And it will be used in the book of Ruth also for the next of kin who has to marry the widow of the person who has no heir. So Boaz has all of this responsibility in terms of ancient practice. So Boaz speaks to her, and he tells her, keep your eyes on the field that's being reaped and follow behind them. I've ordered the young men not to bother you. And if you get thirsty, go to the vessels and drink from what the young men have drawn. So he's taking care of her, doing it very appropriately and properly. And then he goes on at mealtime and he says, come here and eat some of this bread and dip your morsel in the sour wine. So she eats with the reapers and she eats, it says, until she was satisfied and she had some left over. Now, the later biblical interpreters in the time of Jesus, before and just after, and Matthew may have very well known these traditions, they say that that satisfaction is a sign of the Messianic era, of God's continuing to feed God's people into the time of the Messiah. So she's um, uh, well taken care of, and she goes home and she's taken up all that she's gathered. And she's got plenty to take home to her mother-in-law, and she shows it, and uh, and then she took out and gave her what was left over after she had been satisfied. That was the meal. And so her mother-in-law says, where did you glean today and where have you worked? Blessed be the one who took notice of you. So she tells her the story. So Naomi thinks, the man is a relative of ours, one of our nearest kin. Remember the nearest kinsman? Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay close by my young men until they have finished all my harvest. Naomi said, it is better, my daughter, that you go out with his young women. Otherwise, someone might bother you in another field. So she stayed close to the young women of Boaz, gleaning until the end of the barley and her wheat harvest, and she lived with her mother-in-law. So time passes, in other words. And then Naomi, who's still thinking about what's going to happen to Ruth, says, I need to seek some security for you. Now here's our kinsman Boaz, with whose young women you have been working. He's winnowing the barley tonight at the threshing floor. Now go and wash and anoint yourself and put on your best clothes. She's helping her to seduce Boaz. I mean, if this looks a little bit, how should we say, a little bit precarious, it is, but she's creating a situation in which Boaz will have to do his duty because he is the next kinsman. And so she goes and follows Naomi's instructions, and Boaz eats and he gets drunk and he lies down. And so she goes and she says, I am Ruth, your servant. He says, who are you? Because she goes and she lies down at his feet and she says, he says, who are you? He wakes up and says, who are you? And she says, I am Ruth, your servant. Spread your cloak over your servant, for you are next of kin. And the word for cloak there is kanaf, which means wing. It's, remember where God says to the people of Israel at Sinai, I've borne you up on eagle's wings, the wings of God, like God is like the mother bird. And so his cloak is called, the corner of his cloak, it's called a wing. And then he says, may you be blessed by the Lord, my daughter. This last instance of your loyalty is better than the first. And then he goes on and he's asking God to take her under God's wings. And that's very, very beautiful. And it's also seen as a metaphor, a symbol for conversion in later Jewish tradition, to come under the wings of God, the wings of the Shekhinah, the glory of God. So there's something interesting here, though. Ruth has tricked Boaz. He's come, he's eaten, he's with the people who are the harvesters, and he's gotten drunk, and she is snuck in under his cloak. And remember, Tamar had tricked Judah. And this is a motif in some of the biblical stories. It's a motif in a lot of literature. The story of the trickster who's in a position of less power to a dominant power. And so the trickster has to use tricks, has to fool the more dominant person in order to get what she or he needs. And so Ruth is a trickster, but Boaz isn't upset. He recognizes his duty. In Naomi has already talked about him as being the Redeemer, the Goel. Now he's going to need to act as the Redeemer with regard to his duty as the nearest kinsman. And so in chapter 4, which is the last scene, there's a whole argument between another kinsman whose first duty it is in terms of the property. So he said, but he sells out the property to Boaz because he's not really ready to cope with taking on the widow. And so Boaz is very much, how shall I say, very much in favor of doing this himself. And he says, I cannot, now, it was the custom in former times, it says in Israel, concerning redeeming and exchanging to confirm a transaction. The one took off a sandal and gave it to the other. So this was the manner of attesting in Israel. So when the next of kin said to Boaz, acquire it for yourself, then Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses today that I have acquired from the hand of Naomi all that belonged to Elimelech and all that belonged to Chilion and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Mahlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's name on his inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place today. You are witnesses. So everybody says, we are witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephratah and bestow a name in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. So they recite this blessing over Boaz and also over Ruth and on the children that they will have together. And so he takes Ruth and she became his wife and she has a son. And then the women say their own blessing. The women around, they say to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without next of kin, and may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher. You can hear the sirens going by. I'm on a busy New York street, so there's sirens going by all the time. Sorry. Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became his nurse. And the women said, a son has been born to Naomi. Isn't that amazing? If the son has been born to Ruth and Boaz, the child has been born to Naomi, the grandmother. They named him Oved. Oved means a servant or a slave. He's going to be God's servant. He became the father of Jesse, the father of David. So that, and then there's a little genealogy of men after that. But that's the story of Ruth. And Ruth is also, she figures in this genealogy. She has has left everything. She's left all that is familiar to her to go follow her mother-in-law Naomi, and she has taken many risks in order to ensure their survival and then the survival of her first husband's house. So it's a very, very beautiful and touching story. She's, of course, the later interpreters towards Jesus's time and just after him, they have to do something with it because she's a great woman and they need to think about who could she have been. So, well, they know she's a Moabite for sure. So they say, she's such a wonderful person. She too must have been of royal lineage. So they make her the daughter of King Eglon, who was a Moabite king. And there's an early second century, just after the time of Matthew, sage who said that Orpah and Ruth were sisters. They were both the daughters of Eglon, and they merited to be Ruth merited to be the ancestor of the king. So this aristocratic lineage is ascribed to Ruth's husband Mahlon as well, and he is called one of the great men and leaders of the generation. Now, there's no evidence of this in the biblical text. It's people filling in the gaps. Just trying to figure out who were these people. Ruth is ancestress of David, and that really dominates the interpreter's interests. They say that the over in Ruth chapter 3, verse 15, Boaz gives 6 measures of barley. And so the interpreters say that stands for Ruth's 6 descendants: David, the Messiah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. So they say she had these 6 really important descendants, and the Messiah was one of them. And so these are some of the things that are going on in the minds of Matthew and his contemporaries as they try to understand the meaning of the story of Ruth. And they say that, as I said, that the food that she had left over from her meal refers to the days of the Messiah. The food that she is given will last until the end of days. The abundance of food, the satisfaction of hunger, her actions, all of these traditions reach back into the time of Matthew and his community. And I wonder to myself, these are people who experienced at the end of the first century the ever-present threat of hunger and drought and famine. They had known the destruction of the War of 70. They knew about the destruction of the temple. Some of them might have been refugees even from Judea, fleeing north. And so as they read this story of Ruth, they may have remembered the mother, Ruth, whose hunger was satisfied in a way that reached even to the Messianic era. She's a Moabite, and the rabbis think of her as a proselyte, or as a convert. And that certainly would have resonated with these people, these followers of Jesus at the end of the first century, many of whom themselves were converts, were former pagans. She is a Moabite and a Gentile who becomes part of the Jewish people and a mother in Israel through conversion. She's righteous in relation to her observance of Torah. And finally, she's the modest woman whose union with Boaz is defended as righteous, and the conception of whose child has a quality of the miraculous. Now, let's look at the last woman. The fourth woman is called, Matthew doesn't even give us her name. She is called simply the wife of Uriah. He doesn't mention her name, but the biblical text certainly does. In Hebrew, it's Bathsheba or Bathsheba in English, or Bersabe in Greek. I think it's Betsabe in Spanish, right? Yes, I can see that. And so he doesn't even tell us the initial designation from 2 Samuel 11, verse 3. 2 Samuel 11, verse 3 talks about her as being Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite. It identifies her by her name as well as the names of her father and husband. Matthew's usage reflects the designation in 2 Samuel 11 to 12, where Bathsheba is associated with Uriah the Hittite in 11:3 and 11:26, where she's called the wife of Uriah. We're pregnant with David's child. She laments over her dead husband Uriah. The link appears again in chapter 12, after David has taken her as his wife. So Matthew is usage not only makes clear Solomon's lineage, but evokes the story behind the parentage. Like just not even calling her name, he just called her the wife of Uriah. He reminds us that this original union was adulterous, that Solomon is indeed the son of Bathsheba and David, but Bathsheba had been the wife of a Hittite soldier murdered by his lord to cover up an adulterous union. Her ethnicity is not disclosed. She's the daughter of Eliam. David's warriors, or the Givorim, the mighty men, that was a circle of very close warriors. There's a list of them, and it includes Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, the Gilonite, which is included in the same list that ends with Uriah the Hittite. That list includes many non-Israelites. So weren't they all at war with one another? Some of them were and some of them weren't. And excuse me, but even in ancient times, the land was mixed. The peoples of the land, there were the whole mixture of ethnic groups. And Uriah is a Hittite, which is an ethnic group that comes from what is now present-day Turkey and Syria, and they'd sort of made their way into what's now Israel and Palestine. Gilo, it says Eliam was the son of Ahithophel the Gilonite. Gilo, according Joshua calls it a Judahite town, but archaeological evidence indicates that it was a Canaanite settlement near Jerusalem. And the name Ahithophel is it's like a worshiper of Baal. It's not a Judahite or Israelite name. And so it's very possible that Bathsheba is a Canaanite. So but it's not definitive. Her ethnicity is left open-ended. But whatever her ethnic identity was, her first husband was a Hittite, a fact that the text mentions 4 times. And so there's a sense of otherness around um, Bathsheba and her identity. Now, if Ahithophel, Eliam, the son of Ahithophel, it was indeed Bathsheba's father, she's tied to David's inner circle through husband and grandfather, no matter what her ethnic identity was. And if this is also the case, she's also associated with the court through her grandfather Ahithophel, who was David's counselor and who would eventually join the conspiracy of David's son Absalom against his father and would betray David. So Bathsheba is thus the daughter and granddaughter of men who are among David's closest followers, and she's the granddaughter of a traitor. She first appears in 2 Samuel chapter 11, and David is strolling on his rooftop, and he sees this very beautiful woman bathing, and he inquires about her identity. He has no business doing that. She's bathing on the roof of her home, and the scene is one in which she thinks she's unobserved, but she isn't. And so he inquires about her, and he will send for her. What does this mean? Couldn't she have said no? Well, actually, no, she couldn't say no. It's a king. And the king, ancient kings in ancient Israel, kings in many cultures, highly placed politicians, as we know from my own country, they assume they have a right to women. And so David had power of life and death over her, as he had over, and we're not used to thinking, David's a hero to us, and rightly so. But heroes are not necessarily one thing or another. They're a mixture. They, just as Abraham lied and tricked, just as some of these, as Ruth herself had tricked Boaz, David is committing evil. And so he wants this woman, and he has her sent for. So she goes. There's an interesting symbolism about this bathing. It occurs in some other places in the biblical text. Pharaoh's daughter goes to the river to bathe when she finds Moses, and she becomes Moses's stepmother. Ruth bathes as she prepares for her encounter with Boaz at the threshing floor. Later in the story of Susanna, in chapter 13 of the book of Daniel, Susanna goes into this garden to prepare a bath. If indeed Bathsheba is a non-Israelite and non-Judahite woman, all of these women are non-Israel, well, the Pharaoh's daughter, I should say, at least, and Ruth are non-Israelite women who become essential to Israel's story. So yes, Bathsheba's bathing has many levels of meaning. It will take her into the court of David in the how shall I say, in the equivalence of a rape, but it also is setting the scene for her becoming a mother in Israel. She's tied to David's adultery and to his murder of Uriah. The biblical text does not criticize her, nor does the interpretation of the text and the interpreters before and after Jesus. The focus is on David's guilt, a point that's illustrated by Nathan's message in 1 Samuel chapter 12. Bathsheba is a woman confronted by her king. The power difference means that whatever matters of desire might be in play, whatever Bathsheba wishes, it is David who's responsible, as the biblical text suggests. Both power and guilt rest with him. The framework of war, aggression, and sex provides the context for David's adultery or rape with Bathsheba. The punishment called down on him is the death of their unnamed child. And it will leave Bathsheba bereft of her son in mourning, even as she had been left mourning the death of her murdered husband, Uriah. And then she disappears. Well, she disappears after the birth of Solomon. It says David goes in to comfort the mourning Bathsheba, and then later she bears their son Solomon. She disappears. We next meet her in David's old age in 1 Kings in the first chapter. And she goes, she reappears, I should say. Solomon is now all grown up. He's an adult, but so are his half brothers. David is old and he can't get warm. And so he's been given this young girl, Abishag, a Shunammite, to keep his bed warm, to keep him warm. It says he did not know her sexually. She's keeping him warm. He's frail. And his sons are plotting behind him. And the one son, Adonijah, who's the
Vamos a esperar un momentito a la hermana, que ella había comentado que tenía problemas de conexión, así que esperemos que logre reconectarse. Nos quedamos con Betsabé. En todo caso, si ya se les van ocurriendo algunas preguntas o comentarios, si quieren utilizar el chat, podemos ir adelantando eso o escribiéndolas, porque esta ya es la cuarta mujer, ¿verdad?, de la genealogía del evangelio de Mateo. Y dado que el recorrido ha sido interesante y tan amplio, pues si ya se nos van ocurriendo algunas cositas, podemos escribirlas. Así aprovechamos el tiempo mientras la hermana viene, de regreso. Vamos a ver si logra escribirme.
there, I'm back in.
Oh, there we go.
Yes. I
You're back.
apologize, people, that the internet connection in this part of the city is very weak. So it comes in and out. So we've got,
Yeah,
are we
Bathsheba.
okay?
Yes.
Okay. So Adonijah is plotting. And Nathan the prophet gets word of this. And so he goes to Bathsheba and he says, have you heard the plot? And he said, you go in to David and make sure he names Solomon specifically to be his successor. And so Bathsheba goes to the king. She makes her obeisance. She bows down. And he says to her, what do you want? And she says, you swore to your servant by the Lord your God, saying, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne. Now he hasn't, but she's putting the idea in his head. And so he he makes this happen. So Nathan then comes in and he says, and the king is told, here's the prophet Nathan. And so he comes in and he says, my lord the king, have you said Adonijah shall succeed me as king and he shall sit on my throne? And he goes and tells him about this plot. So then King David says, summon Bathsheba to me. And he swears, he says, as the Lord lives, as I swore to you by the Lord, the God of Israel, your son Solomon shall succeed me as king, and he shall sit on my throne in my place. So will I do this day. And Bathsheba bowed with her face to the ground and did obeisance to the king and said, may my Lord King David live forever. And so that is all we hear about Bathsheba. So we have these four women, and then we have Mary. Then we have Mary. And Mary is found, you wouldn't know. We sometimes we think we know a lot about Mary, but Matthew doesn't tell us much at all. He tells us what? He tells us Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary, who bore Jesus, who is called the Messiah. And then after the genealogy, he immediately proceeds to the vision of, he tells us how Jesus is born. He said, when his mother Mary had been engaged to Joseph, but before they lived together, she was found to be pregnant from the Holy Spirit. And Joseph is called a righteous man, and you know the story. The story, he doesn't want to shame her publicly. And so he plans to divorce her quietly. Now, there's no such thing as a quiet divorce when there are documents that have been signed that are public. Everything is public. But Joseph wants to do the right thing by Mary. But just as he's resolved to do this, an angel appears to him and says, do not be afraid to take Mary as your wife, for the child conceived in her is from the Holy Spirit. She will bear a son, and you are to name him Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. And then all of this took place, etc., to fulfill the prophecy. So this is how Jesus is born. This is Mary's a virginal conception of Jesus. And then we see her again in this visit of the Magi. Jesus is born in Bethlehem, and Magi come from the east to see the child. They've seen a star and they want to see the child. Interestingly enough, we always think of three Magi, and that's because there were three gifts. But there could have been more. There could have been more. And there could have been women Magi because there were women astrologers in the ancient world. So, but we have these Magi who come to see this child, and they find the child following the star. They find the child in the house they find the child with Mary, his mother, and they knelt down and paid him homage, etc. And then we see Joseph having another dream in which he's told to take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until he's told, for Herod is about to search for the child to destroy him. We see later on the return from Egypt. We don't know how long, the story doesn't tell us how long they were there, but that they're to take the child and go back to the land of Israel, except Joseph he doesn't go back to Bethlehem because he hears that Archelaus, Herod has died in the meantime, and Archelaus, his son, who was as bad as Herod was, is ruling there. So he's afraid to go back there. And so he's warned in a dream and he goes to Galilee and makes his home in Nazareth. And that's all we hear until the end of chapter 12, where Mary, Jesus, and she's not even, her name isn't given, it's just his mother. Jesus has been speaking and he's speaking to the crowds. His mother and his brothers are standing outside and they want to speak to him. And so somebody says to him, "Look, your mother and your brothers are standing outside wanting to speak to you." But to the one who told him this, Jesus replied, "Who's my mother and who are my brothers?" And pointing to his disciples, he said, "Here are my mother and my brothers. For whoever does the will of my Father in heaven is my brother and sister and mother." That's really heavy. Jesus is starting a new mode of being family. And his mother does not have central place in this. His mother has place only insofar as she does the will of his Father in heaven. That's really radical. And then at the end of chapter 13, he's come to his hometown and he's begun to teach the people in the synagogue. And people are astounded and they say, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these deeds of power? Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary? And are not his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas? And are not all his sisters with us? Where then did this man get all this?" And they took offense at him. But Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own hometown and in their own house." And he did not do many deeds of power there because of their unbelief. And that is, we don't hear any more about Mary in the Gospel of Matthew. She's not even at the crucifixion or the resurrection in Matthew. She's there in some of the other Gospels. She's at the cross um, uh, in John, and she's at the Pentecost narrative in the book of Acts, but we hear very, very little of her. We have other stories that come from the 2nd century that fill in gaps because people always want to fill in the gaps, right? But here she is at the end of the genealogy, and she's preceded by all of these women who have something to tell us in terms of Matthew. Matthew is telling us, I think, for me at least, and you might find some other things that he's telling us. Matthew speaking to to a community that's trying to incorporate Jews and Gentile members, believers in Jesus. He's talking about women in the genealogy who became central, really, to the history of the people, whose ethnicity was either questionable, not known, or who were from enemy people, like Rahab was from the enemies. Bathsheba, we're not certain about. But certainly in her family line, there were people who were enemies and traitors. And it tells us something, I think, about the need for the community to include everybody. It also says something for me that's very precious about an understanding of Jesus, Son of God, who becomes one of his people. And he doesn't just become one of the people that are holy. He becomes one of the people that includes sinners and saints and enemies and people who are sort of on the margins of things. He includes everybody. And I think for me, it's a very challenging story, a very beautiful story. How women like Tamar and Rahab and Ruth become the mothers of prophets and kings, and then of all of us. And so that's all I have to share with you right now. And I invite you, David has we have a few reflection questions to put up. If you don't have to use them, okay? These are just things to kind of get you started. And take a few minutes and sit with these stories and ask yourselves questions and ask yourselves, what were there any surprises tonight in these stories? And even if they're bad surprises, what are the surprises? And what did you like? What pleased you in these stories? What made you think? And then we'll come back together in a few minutes and you can share your thoughts and you can share your questions. And if you have questions, do my best to answer them. If I know something, I'll tell you, I'll share what I know. And if I don't know it, I'll tell you I don't know. Okay?
Thank you, Sister Celia. You just let us know. I will try to translate one of the questions that we already have in the chat. Just
Okay.
in case.
You're in the chat. Okay, great.
There is at least one, but I will try
Oh,
to translate it
here's it. Oh, yeah, yeah. I
because
can
it's a
see it.
long commentary. So,
I can see. Let's see. I can read it.
okay, good. I put in the English translation just in case
Oh, okay,
I need
great.
a version.
Okay. It's referring more to a small, powerless people. It's not really a woman per se, but rather a people or family. She has to use it. Yes. I'm not sure I understand about a family. Okay, why they're called Moabites. Moab was a territory, its own territory. It was outside of Judah and outside of the people of Israel, and it was its own. They were their own ethnic group. Um, they had their own king. Yeah, Ruth for sure saves her family and its lineage. Absolutely. Her clan, and yes, and her whole extended family. I think it's about, yeah, it's about individual women characters, but they represent more than just themselves. Yes, for sure. Thank you for your question.
Hmm. There are other comments, and Jose Murillo says, this remind us, and it opens, the columns. It says,
Yeah,
where the sin has been abundant, the grace has been more abundant. I don't know the passage by memory. It says, God's plan is strengthened in front of our limitations, or among our limitations. That's his
yeah,
commentary. Um,
yeah, yeah.
hmm. Si hay preguntas o comentarios sobre lo que la hermana planteó, las podemos escribir o también los podemos decir y Ron nos ayudará a traducirle a la hermana. Así que podemos aprovechar si tenemos, por supuesto, porque el tiempo se nos está acortando. Ok,
Yo
y
voy a hacer mi pregunta en forma oral. Em, no sé, ¿me escuchan? ¿Me escuchan? Sí.
gracias. Sí, Ana, la escuchamos bien. Just to confirm,
Sí,
this
ok,
Sister Celia, are
gracias,
you
gracias.
hearing the
La
Spanish
relación de las
translation?
4 mujeres con Jesús es en el aspecto de sangre, ¿verdad? Y también en la parte profética. ¿Estoy en lo correcto?
¿Podrías formularla otra vez como pregunta? Nada más.
Ok. ¿Cuál es la relación, una conclusión en cuanto a la relación de Jesús con las 4 mujeres? Es una relación en el aspecto de sangre y, y una relación profética.
Si la relación
Tal
entre
vez
Ajá.
las 4 mujeres, en conclusión, ¿cuál es la genealogía con Jesús? ¿Es sanguínea o es profética, nada más?
Claro, claro, claro. Does it make sense, Sister Celia? The question is that if when Matthew writes the genealogy and includes the four women, can we
Yeah,
speak
yeah.
of a blood line, or are we speaking about a prophetic notion within the what Matthew is writing, or why are they there and how are they related?
I think that's a really good question. So is it like a prophecy she wants to know, or is it, or exactly how are they there? Matthew's wants to tell us how Jesus is son of Abraham and son of David. So he's setting up a genealogy of David's line, and before and after David, down to the time of Jesus. And he traces that line. Now, he's skipped a lot of generations, he's skipped all sorts of stuff, but he's giving us what he thinks are the most important pieces of this genealogy. And it has to do with being the son of David. And so in the leading up to David, all the way up through Bathsheba, he includes these women who are key and essential to the continuation of the line of the family, of the family of Judah, of the house of Judah, that will lead up to David. Okay. And the thing is that's interesting to me is that he has, for the most part, traced the genealogy through the male side, and that's the way they did it in up until the first and second centuries. The genealogy was our ancestry was traced to the male. It shifted to the female in the second century. But he's tracing it through the male, but he includes women at certain key points. One of them is with Tamar, and that is to find out how did this mess, this confusion in Judah's family get resolved. And he's including a story which is not pretty. It's not at all agreeable. It's in some ways shocking, and he's included it deliberately because that's the tradition he's received. But it's a tradition that he believes um, shows another kind of righteousness, the righteousness of this woman who got what she needed to get to continue the family, to safeguard the family. It was a reminder also of Judah that he had really done wrong by his family, and he had to acknowledge it. And he is praised in the tradition for acknowledging it, his sin. So that's her. Rahab saves the people of Israel as they're coming into this new land, and saves and saves her own family in the process. And she becomes part of the history of the people, and the line goes through her. And so there again, she's somebody, I mean, whoever would think that a prostitute would get considered this hero, and she's a hero, and she's a mother of prophets and kings. And so this is the reason why. And then we have Bathsheba, Ruth, I should say first before Bathsheba, we have Ruth. And they are stories of women who are in really hard situations, who become saviors of their people, saviors of their families, and because of them, Matthew is saying, through them we have Jesus. And did I answer the question? That's, I think, his reason.
Sí, sí,
Okay,
sí,
good,
sí está muy
good,
bien, gracias.
good, excellent. Okay,
We
thank
have two
you.
hands. We have Melvin, I don't know where he went, and also Silvia.
Yes.
Don Melvin, ¿usted está por ahí todavía? Yo lo vi. Ah, bien. Si
Okay.
quiere
Oh, we have
plantear
a,
la
Ah,
pregunta o el comentario despacio
sí,
para
sí,
que Ron pueda
buenas
traducir, y
noches
luego
y
doña
muchas
Silvia.
gracias a
okay.
Celia
We have
por la
we have
charla muy interesante.
oh,
La consulta es la siguiente, es que a María normalmente se le presenta como una mujer muy pasiva, que todo lo guarda dentro de su corazón. Sin embargo, hay otras versiones un poco más atrevidas o interpretaciones más atrevidas. Por ejemplo, cuando va, usted lo mencionó, cuando va con sus hermanos a buscar a Jesús, algunos dicen de que María estaba como avergonzada de Jesús, porque no era normal que una mujer saliera, perdón, de que Jesús saliera de su casa joven y que se dedicara a andar predicando. Entonces, ¿cuál es su criterio acerca de María? Si esa mujer que conocemos los católicos como pasiva, que todo lo guardaba dentro de su corazón, o bien ese criterio un poco más atrevido de que María más bien se sentía avergonzada por el comportamiento extraño que tenía Jesús de abandonar la casa e irse, irse de la casa y empezar a predicar. Gracias.
okay. The reception, okay. Thank you very much. Muchísimas gracias. And the reception is a little poor. So David, can you give me the question more clearly? I know he wanted me to talk more about Mary, but
Yes, but
I
maybe the main thing is that what's your opinion about Mary? Because what he has heard is that there are like two interpretations, like one that Mary is a quite passive character. She leaves things and she keeps everything within herself. She doesn't seem to be quite, you know, active or engaging, but there are other traditions. For example, when Mary goes out and she goes to take Jesus, with other relatives, and Melvin also says that he has heard that some people mentioned that she was quite kind of embarrassed of what Jesus was doing. So, but that shows like a more active Mary, that goes and interferes. So, what's your opinion? That's what he wants to
What's
know.
my
What's your
opinion?
opinion about Mary, the mother of Jesus? Yes.
Okay. Okay. Do I think Mary was passive? No. I think she was my image of Mary is a very tough woman. She had to be. She was a mom at the end of the first, in the first part of the first century. Um, she and Joseph had Jesus. They had to bring him up. That's a very active thing. Um, tonight, I was only talking about what we know in Matthew. And what we know in Matthew is not much in some ways. In some ways, it's a lot. But it's in terms of how she operated, how she acted. Um, we have the piece which has her with his brothers, his sisters, and they've all gone out. They want to talk to Jesus. And the whole gang is there. And Jesus is saying, I mean, and to me, it's a shocking thing. I mean, if I had been Mary, I would have been hurt, and I probably would have been angry at my son for saying these things. Like, my real mother is, the people who do the will of God and hear the word of God and do it. So, and on the other hand, maybe she knows has an idea about what he's doing, this kind of radical new thing. So yeah. Now, is it strange that I don't know anymore? We don't know any more from Matthew? No, it's not strange. These ancient writers, they wrote very little about people's personalities.
Hmm.
They were their focus was on um, deeds and teaching. And so um, some of the things that you and I imagine about Mary, um, uh, and like to think about, how she might have acted. Matthew was just, he might have been interested, but he wasn't interested in putting it down. We have a different set of traditions in Luke where she and Joseph take Jesus up to Jerusalem, and we have the story about him getting lost. And that's another very interesting piece. So yeah, I don't know whether this is at all helpful, that Mary's part of this circle, that we don't find from the gospel stories as much as we would like to find in there.
Thank you, Sister Celia. We're gonna take one more question just to take you into consideration for your time and also for Ron, who has been translating. Is that okay?
That's fine. It's
Great.
fine. I'm fine.
We have Silvia from Nicaragua. Doña Silvia, vamos a tomar una última pregunta o comentario ya para ir cerrando.
Buenas noches.
Buenas noches.
Pues más que todo, no sé si será pregunta, pero vea, me gustó todo lo que usted vino diciendo y sobre todo me encanta esa palabra de ancestras, nuestras ancestras para sentirnos dentro de la lectura. También otra palabra que como que suena muy fuerte en la lectura, que es prostitutas. Esa palabra como que suena fuerte porque son tildadas, no todas, pero son tildadas de prostitutas. Una frase que dijo usted que dice, Judas no miraba a una mujer, miraba a una prostituta. Y también hay otra frase que me gustó mucho que dice que son los engaños de las mujeres. Son como frases muy fuertes porque a veces nosotros nos miramos en círculos que nos tratan, a veces tenemos que hacer pequeños engaños para proteger, para guardar o para salvaguardar la vida de uno mismo o de nuestros hijos. Entonces esa palabra prostituta en ese contexto era porque las trataban hacia todas las mujeres, o será que el escritor en una manera como ofensiva, esa palabra se siente ofensiva. ¿Será que el escritor la ocupaba como para ofender o era común en ese momento esa palabra de llamarlas prostitutas? Porque de hecho no eran prostitutas ellas, pero sí eran tildadas de prostitutas. Entonces sí era común en ese momento llamar así a las mujeres, porque llamar a una mujer prostituta ahorita en este contexto que vivimos nosotros en esta realidad es muy ofensivo. Gracias.
Gracias,
Gracias.
doña Silvia.
Okay. David, make sure that that I understood that, okay?
Well, but what I get is that she's wondering what's the usage of the word prostitute in the stories that you read.
Yeah.
Because she, for example, goes to the story of Tamar and she says, well, the narrator is using the word prostitute, but she was not a prostitute. Right. It was Judah who saw her like that. So
Yeah.
how can we explain that? Is it like there is some sort of input that the narrator is bringing, or is it something that Judah, or was it common that women of certain characteristics will be called prostitutes? How can we understand the usage of the word in such
Okay.
in the narrative?
Tamar, and this is part of the trickster. Remember, I said that there was a theme going through of the trickster.
Hmm.
Tamar's thinking, I have got to have my rights honored. He is not going to marry me off to his next son, Shelah. That was the proper order of things. And so I have to do the next thing, and that is I have to trick Judah. And so she hears that he's going to this place where there's going to be a big sheep shearing, and she wraps herself up in a way that makes her look like a prostitute. She's completely veiled so that nobody can see who she is. She simply sits, and she's a woman by herself. And so she sits by the side of the road going into the area where the sheep shearing is. And in other words, she makes herself available. She acts like a prostitute. And Judah sees her as a prostitute. He doesn't see Tamar because she's all wrapped up. And he approaches her as a prostitute. That's why that happens there. And with Rahab, she is a prostitute. She's a prostitute and an innkeeper. And some traditions later on say, well, she wasn't really she was just an innkeeper. And maybe yes and maybe no. But in either way, both of them, I mean, Tamar is doing this because it's the only way she can ensure her own survival, the survival of ultimately of Judah's own family. And is Rahab has been doing this before the Israelite spies come, and that is a way for her to make her living. She's a sex worker, as we say in English.
Thank you.
Did I answer the question, Sylvia?
Sí, sí, está bien.
Okay.
Más o menos. Yeah. We will need another session for that, Mark. But no, it was part of the question, and
Okay.
indeed. Well, I think it's time that we come to the end. I translated some of the comments for you, Sister Celia. If you want to check the chat before we close because it
I'm
will
yeah,
disappear.
I'm checking it. Yeah, just a second.
Bueno, muchísimas
Okay,
gracias. Le decía a la hermana Silvia que revisara el chat porque traduje algunos de sus comentarios, los que pude, para colocarlos allí y que ella los pueda leer. Agradecerles a ustedes la presencia y la paciencia de este ejercicio, ¿verdad? Que estamos intentando introducir, de colocar con la ayuda de Ron, ¿verdad? Una traducción simultánea que les facilite un poquito mayor fluidez en las charlas, pero para que podamos tener también a hermanas y a otras personas por acá que nos contribuyan. Eh, Preguntarle a la hermana Celia si tiene alguna palabra o de cierre, ¿verdad? Que quiera dejarle a la comunidad del centro, ¿verdad? De la congregación que se han reunido hoy, esta noche. Hermana Celia, no sé si tiene algo más que quisiera decir para cerrar antes de terminar el espacio.
muchísimas gracias.
Eh, bueno, agradecer una vez más a la hermana Celia por el tiempo, ¿verdad?, de la preparación de la charla y por llevarnos por este camino de las ancestras, un camino largo, muy interesante, muy rico, ¿verdad? Y creo que nos deja con muchas preguntas y con la importancia de considerar estas raíces, ¿verdad?, que están en la tradición judía y que van construyendo también la tradición cristiana de manera muy robusta. Agradecerles a todos y a todas los que se han unido esta noche en nombre del Centro de Estudios y Relaciones Judio-Cristianas de la Congregación de Nuestra Señora de Sion. Esperamos tenerles en otras actividades, talleres, cursos, charlas y bueno, hasta tomarse un cafecito allá en la sede en Moravia. Así que un abrazo y que la pasen muy bien y hasta la siguiente actividad. Sister Celia, great to see you. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank
Bye
you.
bye.
Thank you.
Muchas
Abrazos.
Buenas
gracias.
noches,
Buenas
gracias.
Muchas
noches.
gracias.
Gracias.
Muchas
Hasta luego.
gracias. Hasta luego.
Muchas gracias.
Buenas
Pase
noches y
buena noche.
gracias.
Buenas noches, que estén muy bien.
Buenas noches.
Hasta luego, muchas gracias.
Hasta luego.
Gracias, Ron. Hasta
Chao.
luego, hasta luego.
Sí, Ron, muchísimas gracias.
Gracias a ti. Un abrazo.
Un abrazo, sí.
Hasta luego.